All right, to Russia now, where the governor of the Belgorod region on the border to Ukraine says that 2 people were killed in airstrikes on Wednesday. Belgorod has increasingly been targeted by shelling, with anti-Kremlin Russian fighters believed to be operating in the border zone. Russian authorities now say that they are moving forward with plans to evacuate children and that they plan to scale up security in the area.
This kindergarten in Belgorod is one of many buildings damaged in shelling. The kindergarten principal witnessed the blast firsthand.
It was loud. The glass was ringing. All the doors were shaking. After the last and the loudest bang, we understood that it was somewhere nearby. We didn't even suspect that it was at our place. We thought it was close, but not at our place. Then, when everything calmed down, we saw the aftermath.
No children were injured. But in another part of Belgorod, a man was killed when shrapnel from the shelling hit his car. Russia's military says the attack is aimed at destabilizing the country after its recent election.
Of course, we can respond in the same way, both regarding civilian infrastructure and all the other objects that the enemy attacks. We have our own views on this matter and our own plans. We will follow what we have outlined.
So far, Russia's plans include restricting entry to nearby cities in the Belgorod region and evacuating around 1,200 children. But with the war in Ukraine now on Russia's doorstep, the border region is feeling the effect, and the source of enemy fire is getting harder to detect.
And for more, I want to bring in military analyst Marina Miron from King's College. It's good to see you, Marina. It's, as we know, very difficult to obtain independent and verified information from this border region. What are you hearing about the situation there?
Good evening, Brent. Well, indeed, it's very difficult because there are a lot of videos circulating on what's happening with these cross-border attacks. From the Russian side, they're saying that most of the attacks have been repelled. From the Ukrainian side, it's a completely different pictures, and we have Telegram channels by the respective volunteer groups which are posting the forces in Russia, so crossing the border with Ukraine, allegedly. It's difficult to verify. It seems like the situation, the peak of the situation was on Sunday during the last day of the presidential elections in Russia. It seems to be calming down, but perhaps we're going to see more activities, because I think that in some regions, these volunteer forces are still in Russia. And we're seeing that also by what the Ministry of Defense in Russia is doing, namely evacuation of the Belgorod region.
Yeah, the fact that Russian authorities are now evacuating people from Belgorod, does that mean that they consider the Ukrainian attacks to be more dangerous or more serious than before?
I think both sides gambled on these attacks in a sense, and the border region wasn't very well protected, despite the fact that the Russian side has been complaining about Belgorod shellings for a long time now. And last year, we have seen some cross-border incursions into Belgorod region, but it wasn't anything spectacular, or at least not as spectacular as this year. Therefore, I think that the Kremlin was gambling on the fact that they don't need a good protection there, and all the forces that are needed should be fighting in Ukraine rather than protecting the border. So the Russian border guards was there, the FSB was there, and unfortunately that was not enough for the Russian side. So now they need to take measures, and it's not just about the evacuation of the border region, it's also about the amplification of the scope of the so-called special military operation, namely creation of a buffer zone in Ukraine.
And remind us again of who we're talking about, who's launching these attacks. They've been described as pro-Ukrainian, anti-Kremlin paramilitaries who are attacking in Belgorod. Who are they?
So in the classical sense, we could say that these are insurgents being aided by the Ukrainian armed forces and by Ukrainian intelligence. So you have the Freedom of Russia. This group, for instance, according to its own statements, recruits from those who abandoned the Russian armed forces and who joined in the fight against Putin. Then we have the Siberian battalion. Those are representing minorities in Russia, which they argue are being repressed by the Putin regime. So Yakuts, Burats would be amongst those minorities, again, fighting on the side of the Ukrainian armed forces. And then we have the volunteer corps, the Russian volunteer corps, which consists of Ukrainian Foreign Legion fighters and which is actually a part of the Ukrainian armed forces. So it is very interesting to see that actually these groups are fighting against Putin, but they are fighting, and some of them are actually embedded into the Ukrainian armed forces, and this is according to Ukrainian sources. And of course, the Ukrainian military intelligence is coordinating their actions, because we have to understand an insurgent movement cannot succeed without any external support. They need intelligence, they need arms, they need ammunition, and this is exactly what they're getting from the Ukrainian side. And we also know that the Siberian battalion, for instance, fought on the Ukrainian side in Avdiivka. So I would consider it less than a classical insurgency, but more as an extended arm of the Ukrainian armed forces conducting these attacks.
Yeah, and the optics of this, of course, they don't look good for the Russian president. Russia saying now that it's going to form 2 new army corps by the end of the year. Is it really in the position to do that? And given Ukraine's current difficulties on the battlefield, I mean, what is that going to mean for Ukraine?
Well, I think Russia is in the position to do it right now. It wasn't a month ago, because we were all waiting for the elections and for the outcome of elections. Now, Putin doesn't have his hands tied anymore in terms of increasing the scope of the war in Ukraine. And specifically for that reason, there is a need for more manpower. What plays, of course, into Putin's hands and all these cross-border attacks, we have to look at it from different perspectives. On the one hand, it shows that there are people who are dissatisfied with the regime and who want to fight against it. On the other hand, from Kremlin's perspective, these groups are funded by Ukraine. They're used by Ukraine against us. So they are conducting terrorist attacks on Russia's territory. Hence, we need more people to protect ourselves. And so this fits very nicely into the narrative. And given the fact that such groups, they also need popular support for their cause, which they don't have in Russia, meaning that they could have an opposite psychological effect from what they're seeking to achieve. That means that if Russia is going to expand the scope of its operation and increase the amount of personnel, that doesn't look good for Ukraine given the current situation.
Okay. Military analyst Marina Marone from King's College tonight. As always, Marina, we appreciate your analysis.
Returning to our top story now, and the Ukrainian shelling on the Russian border of Belgorod. Filip Vasilevsky is a former CIA paramilitary case officer. He's now director of the Centre for Intelligence and Non-Traditional Warfare at the Foreign Policy Institute. Welcome to you, sir. When you look at what's happening in and around Belgorod, so these successful attacks from the Ukrainian side on what is a strategically important region to Russia, tell us, what are your immediate impressions?
I would say that you have to look at these attacks in 2 contexts. One is a tactical operation designed probably to relieve pressure from Ukrainian forces under attack in the Donbass and Zaporizhia areas to the south east of the country, but also as a psychological operation to discredit Putin during the elections, which have just passed, and also to show that that his promise that this war is not going to affect the average Russian is not true. It also undermines the Kremlin's claim that all Russians support this war, because what we have in these attacks is 3 Russian volunteer military units fighting on the side of Ukraine against Putin's regime. And those are the people who are undertaking these attacks right now.
I want to pick up on that because, as you say, aside from the strikes by Ukraine, there have been armed raids that have been carried out by these pro-Ukrainian paramilitaries, some of whom are Russian. Tell us, what do you know about them?
These 3 groups have been around for a few years. They're generally made up of either defectors, prisoners of war who've come over to the Ukrainian side, or also ethnic Russians who had immigrated earlier to Ukraine and are also fighting for Ukraine. They're part of many national groups within the international fighters who are fighting for Ukraine. Besides these Russian groups, you also have groups from Belarus, Chechnya, Georgians, and many others. The three that we know are taking part of this are known as the Freedom of Russia Legion, the Russian Volunteer Corps, and the Siberian Battalion, which is one of the newer ones, but it recently been in combat in Avdiivka. They number maybe a few thousand, they're not large, but again, it's a great psychological impact. Shows Russians fighting against Russians on Russian soil against Putin regime and against this war.
Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about Vladimir Putin's response. He and the Kremlin do seem to be taking this quite seriously. Putin has responded personally, saying Russia will respond. Given everything that you've just told us, how big of a challenge are these raids and cross-border strikes for him?
We shouldn't exaggerate their military impact. These are a few thousand men. They're not being supported. Regular Ukrainian forces are not coming across the border. They are coming across the border only a few kilometers. This is not a drive on Belgorod, which is only about 40 kilometers from the border with Ukraine, but instead are dispersed along the border with the Kursk and Belgorod Oblast. In other words, it makes it harder for the Russians to respond, and it makes it harder for them to concentrate their forces against these units. Again, they're just over the border from Ukraine, but they're having an effect because to marshal the forces, Putin is going to, and the Shogoi are going to either have to use reserves they have in Russia themselves, or they're going to have to move troops from the Donbass, Zaporizhia, Kherson battlefields around to Belgorod and Kursk Oblast in order to take care of this. I mean, right now, both sides are limited in manpower. So every little bit that is used here is manpower that cannot be used down in the Donbass.
That was Filip Wasilewski from the Foreign Policy Research Institute. We really appreciate your insights today. Thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you.